Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second session of the day in our policy and leadership tent on the second day of Rail Live on what is another glorious day. Let's hope it stays that way. And this session is about rail freight, future of freight. And I will let the panelists, I think, introduce themselves briefly, and then I'll go straight into the first question. So, first on my left.
Julian Worth, Chair of the Rail Freight Forum, the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. As you can tell from my hair colour, I'm a seriously old git. I've been on the railway 45 years come this September. Freight right the way through.
Hello, Catherine Aldale, Head of Strategy, Policy and Communications at DB Cargo UK. Comparatively box fresh compared to Julian, 8 years on the railway.
Good morning, everybody. Apologies for my distressed look. I was practicing modal shift on the way here. My name is Matthew Wright. I work for Freightliner in the sort of policy and strategy team. I'm even greener than Catherine. I've only been in the industry for 54 weeks.
And I'm Dickon Ross, editor of Rail, and I've only been in that for 3 months, so I'm the new beast. There you go. Right, now, kick off with target for freight was set a little while back, 75%. What do we think of that target? Is it enough? Is it ambitious enough? Is it doable? By when? Just with your thoughts on that future, starting with, I think, on my left.
Very much floor, not ceiling. So the analysis that CILT did right across our members and our other participants, so we're multimodal, multi-sector, was that doubling 100% is eminently achievable. 75% therefore is a little on the cautious side. But where we are, that's completely understandable, and I think it was reasonable for government to set 75%. It's worth saying that, if you read the bland stats at the minute, you could get quite negative about it. But actually, it's pretty miraculous where we are at the minute, because barely 10 years ago, coal was nearly 50% of what we moved by rail, 46% in 2013-14. That has all but gone. The last power station coal train is next Friday. Last one ever. Well, that will leave a few trains a week to Scunthorpe and to Hope Cement Works. So, we've lost nearly 50% of our market in rail freight over the last 10 years. The fact we're nowhere near down that much is testament to how we're already growing other commodities, especially consumer goods, which are about a third up over the last 15 years, and great potential going forward. Great potential. So 75%, absolutely fine with it.
Right. Who are you?
So, fully agree with what Julian said, but it's slightly different aspect. So for me, in terms of the optics of it, it's brilliant that we have a growth target. Be it 75%, 100%, 200%, whatever it is, a growth target set by UK government is a great place to be. And I think that we are in fundamentally a different position to where we were 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago. We now have, 3 series of manifestos on the table, the big 3, all of which contain rail freight for the first time ever. So we're incredibly proud of that. So to have a growth target is a game changer for the industry. Do I think 75% is ambitious enough? Categorically not. We aimed for trebling. The data is there, the markets are there, the volume is there to treble by 2050. So no, so we're very much looking at 75% as a floor and not a ceiling, and I think we can reach that very, very quickly. But from an optics perspective, yeah, I think it's great. So we've got a target in place.
Okay, so it's something.
Yeah, I echo much what Julian and Catherine just said. Agree very much with Julian in respect of the relative volume that we've achieved in terms of the depreciation in coal volumes, and then the return in terms of intermodal to support that. But in terms of modal share, which we're considering here, we've still got a long way to go. The last 6 years, I think road freight has increased by about 14%, and just by recapturing the lost coal volumes, rail volumes have remained flat, but in a modal share perspective, therefore, we are a worse position compared to road. And in terms of the optics, very much echo Catherine's point in terms of it being a floor, not a ceiling. It is ambitious, it is obtainable, but we still need a plan to get there. It's all very well saying it and thinking, oh yeah, that's a realistic target, but we need to get on and actually find ways of actually achieving it still, and that's where we're keen for further discussion.
Okay, so the last financial year we've had no growth in freight, and it fell by a third in a decade. But because of the coal thing that you mentioned, and because of the way it's changing, that's maybe not such a bad thing in a sense. And if the target is a bit low, that means you can blow the doors off, right? So that'll look good. What will it take to get there then? So Does road policy need to change? Thinking of rail, as part of, does it need to be always freight? Does it need to be part of a wider freight policy? Does the road policy need to change, or the incentive before you can get those results in freight? And I'll start with Matthew. I think I was going to go backwards and forwards. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. I thought we were going to start next with Catherine. And that way. I think it has to be considered holistically. I don't think targeting road is going to be entirely helpful politically, never mind in terms of a logistics chance. We in the rail freight industry need road for the final mile delivery, and we'll still need it in terms of a backup and in for particular routes that aren't served by rail. So I don't think focusing purely on changing road policy to support rail policy is necessarily the best way. And we are advocating very much for a holistic approach to policy, an integrated transport solution, which is the best way forward. In terms of costs, it's simply there's a divergence over the last 10, 15 years in terms of cost for road and rail. Take out all of the explicit charges for road and rail specifically. We often compare fuel duty versus track access as a comparator between how they've been treated in policy over that period. Last 15 years, fuel duty on trucks has been frozen. Track access for rail freight has increased up to 150%. So clearly we are at a disadvantage in terms of the way that the economics have treated rail freight. And in that sense, there needs to be a level playing field and some mitigating measures for the advantage that road currently has.
Okay. Level playing field. What do you think?
Categorically not. We need to bloody level the playing field. We're operating in two different markets. It's not apples and apples, and it hasn't been for a very long time, as Matthew alluded to. Fuel duty, hasn't risen in the same way that track access has. It isn't a level playing field for us. And then when you look at the different externalities facing our sector, things like port access charges, port charges just increasing exponentially, we're at an unfair cost disadvantage, really, for modal shift. So do we need to look at road? Yes. But we also need to look at rail in the same way, and then look at how we can create a policy landscape with levers and incentives that promote modal shift to rail.
Okay.
We shouldn't think of it as road versus rail. We as rail operators and rail proponents need road. We need road for the final mile deliveries, because virtually all rail hauls are no longer direct from source to origin, which they were at one time. We need road as part of that supply chain, that multimodal supply chain along the way. So where it really comes into focus, so do you go road or do you go rail, is in trunking. The longer distance trunking moves over about 200 kilometres. That's our key area to focus upon. So we actually want road, and we want road to be really efficient on those short hauls to and from rail terminals and distribution centres. But we've got to get the balance more right, if you like, on the trunk haul. And absolutely endorse what my colleagues have said there. And of course, there is the vexed question coming up quite quickly now about road user charging, because fuel duty won't be relevant in about 10 or 15 years' time, because we won't be using liquid fuel. So at that point, road user charging is almost inevitable, and that is an opportunity for policymakers to address this unlevel playing field that we have. We can't wait that long, and we certainly need measures before then to balance up this inequity which has developed because of fuel duty being frozen over the last few years.
You were saying that it's not really necessarily road versus rail, but yesterday in the engineering tent where they were discussing freight, we heard that speakers saying, well, actually our biggest competitor is not another freight company, it's road. Anyone want to comment on that? Is it?
Yeah, so that is absolutely right. We are three large operators, and we do chase the same contracts, but predominantly road is our absolute competitor at this moment in time because of the unnaturally low cost of HGV charges. So now customers, rather than looking at the longer term economics, rather than looking at the absolute environmental advantages of using rail as part of their trunk haul, they're switching to road because it's unnaturally cheap at this point in time.
Okay. So we were talking about charges there, but we also mentioned incentives. So how do, it's the carrot and the stick, isn't it? How do incentives need to improve for freight to make a difference?
So one of the key things that a new ministerial team will need to grasp is that a very, very small amount of money spent on rail can leverage really substantial gain. So small amounts of public sector investment will bring forth substantial private sector investment from the freight operators, but also people like terminal investors, because virtually all the investments being made in rail over the last 20 years has been by non-railway companies. It's been by commercial property developers building new strategic rail freight interchanges with superb intermodal terminals which we can then use. So government putting basically tens of millions of pounds into rail freight can leverage hundreds of million pounds of private sector investment. It can also make very, very substantial difference to achievement of the objectives for modal shift. So you just have to look at what DP World have done at Southampton over the last 9 months now, where they've charged £10 a box extra on every box coming over the quay. Boxes going by rail over longer distances have that £10 refunded, but the pot of money that accumulates is then put into incentivise use of rail under 140 miles from Southampton. The results of that have been quite astonishing. So at the start of it, the rail market share at Southampton was barely 20%. Arguably, it was down about 18%. It is now at about 35%, and they're targeting 40% next year. So you can just see there how really quite small incentives can really ramp up. Because never forget that transport and logistics is a highly competitive business. Margins are typically about 3 to 5%. So people will switch operators and switch modes for a very small amount of money. It follows, therefore, that the incentives don't have to be very large to create a very significant move to rail. And that applies whether it's on the revenue side for the rates, things like mode shift revenue support, which I'm sure my colleagues will want to talk about, but it also applies to the capital side, because we have big barriers to entry for rail freight. If you want to build a new siding or a new terminal, it is inordinately expensive. So we need freight facilities grants to be reinstated in England and with bigger budgets in Scotland and Wales to reduce that barrier to entry. I would say, and I'm going to be a bit controversial now, Dickon, but because this is an engineering show, our engineering costs and our timescales of new sidings and new facilities are off the scale, too expensive and too long. I'm not going to tell you where, but one recent terminal development, the Network Rail cost of connecting the network, £45 million for one terminal, and it's running 9 months late. We have very little to be proud of in terms of helping our customers to connect into the railway.
Yeah, that is something
it's our own doing.
In the engineering tent yesterday as well, actually, yes. Incentives.
Incentives, yeah, I fully support. Even Julian's contentious view there, I do support it. But, you know, as a sector, we're not asking for the moon on a stick when it comes to financial support. We're really not. If we look at it compared to what the road sector gets or what other sector gets, it's really not that huge. So basic things like a continuation of MSRS, our modal shift revenue support scheme, it's a game changer in terms of promoting that modal shift for our customers. Things like, as Julian alluded to, the freight facilities grant. Again, when you're looking at startup costs, it's a game changer. It can make the difference between switching from road to rail. And energy costs as well. You know, it's had such a burden on us over the past few years, the rising cost of electricity, and we as an operator had to make a really difficult decision to stop using our electric locomotives. And when you bring that into the argument of sustainability, you know, we're choosing to be economically sustainable and viable rather than using our Class 90 locomotives because of the cost of the overheads. So, you know, there's an awful lot to do when it comes to incentive, when it comes to charges and to promote modal shift, to allow us to deliver more by rail.
Yeah, not too much to add. I think Freightliner have added, on the back of the DP scheme, one additional path and service, daily service to Cardiff. And yeah, it shows immediately the growth opportunities that can be encouraged from such a relatively small cost to end user. Following on from Catherine's point on modal shift revenue support, the budget for that was £20 million set, 20 or so years ago. It should be, if it had matched inflation, be 35 million, and it's still only 20 today. So there's a significant shortfall in terms of real terms value that they're supporting the industry. This is DFT. So in terms of what we are doing in terms of trying to get the FT and politicians to understand it, one of our key calls at the moment is for a doubling of that pot. In addition to the reintroduction of the freight facilities grant, as Julian and Catherine mentioned. I think there's also, I was at an event yesterday surrounded by a load of venture capitalists. And I joined the rail industry a year ago and was befuddled by the lexicon and the words and the language that's used in the rail industry. Surrounded by venture capitalists, they were speaking a completely different language. Completely didn't understand a single thing they were saying. But it just showed to me, and this is touching on Julian's point, when we talk about incentives, we're not just talking about incentives in terms of the OPEX cost for moving goods by rail. We need to be looking at that incentives for bringing new investment into the industry. And there's a big challenge there in terms of how we communicate to those people like venture capitalists, as I came across yesterday, and how we try to instill confidence in them to invest in rail, because I think there's a massive shortcoming at the moment in terms of their understanding and opportunities that are available in rail and our ability to sell that. And some work in sort of incentivizing that and making that a little bit easier and more accessible, I think is something which doesn't really get much discussion, much airtime, but I think would really be worthwhile, especially given the tight fiscal constraints we face over the next few control periods.
Dick, can I add something on this, please? So we need to understand where rail fits in a supply chain, in a customs distribution operation. And if you look at what opportunities that presents us, the two major ones are the very substantial growth that's coming at us in construction materials, where the final exhaustion of sand and gravel in the southeast is going to lead to a really big increase in limestone from the Peak and the Mendips and sea dredge sand from the Thames and other ports into the southeast and to a degree East Anglia. That is one which, please don't take this the wrong way, we don't have to do too much to do that apart from secure the capacity. But the other big market opportunity we have is in long distance trunking of consumer goods. Now, some of you will be aware what Tesco do. Tesco currently have a network of about 6 trains a day, moving about 500 units nationally across the UK each day. They refer to it as the backbone of their supply chain operation. They're about to ramp that up with another 2 trains, which will take to about 750. The reason I mention this, though, is that Tesco are almost unique in having that amount of volume available to them. They can do what they like. They've got enough train and volume themselves. Virtually everybody else doesn't have that amount of volume. So it's critical, if we're going to expand our market share of domestic trunking, that we have multi-customer trains where people can book on 6, 10, even maybe 1 unit per train per night or whatever it is. We do that very successfully from Daventry to central Scotland, and have done for many years now. But if we're going to make a success of this, we need to see that sort of multi-customer train introduced on all the main routes in the UK, basically parallel to the motorways. But, and here's the rub, there's a big commercial risk for the operator or the logistics operator who fronts up that operation, because at the start, people won't trust the train until they've seen it running for a few months. So you haven't got the revenue, but you incur the cost. So one of the things that CILT has suggested to government is what we're calling an incubator grant, that for new domestic intermodal services, for the first 3, 6, whatever months, there's some support to enable commercial organisations working on narrow margins to start these services, to build the market, and if it doesn't fly, well, that's the end of it. But all probably it will fly, and it becomes self-sustaining some months down the road. It might even take the form of a loan rather than a once-off grant. But it's really important that we target these incentives and these measures where the opportunities are. And that multi-customer long-distance trunking operation is a really important one.
Before I open it up to audience questions, I've just got one more topical question, which I'm going to start, I think, with Matthew on. After the July the 4th, what do you think will change for freight, and what do you hope will change for freight?
Well,
I'm assuming probably a change of government to Labour rather than Reform.
although Reform's policies on rail freight were, I think, to quote it, scrap HS2, the huge vanity project, I think was how it was described in their manifesto. And then an encouragement and acceleration for rail freight connections, particularly in the coast, which was an interesting proposal by them. I think, as Catherine said, what is quite encouraging is that we're in a fairly positive place. All 3 main parties, even the Greens and I guess even Reform, are all recognise the value of rail freight and are keen to certain degrees, establish new targets to achieve it. I think it was notable that Labour have decided to adopt the same Great British Railways name for the new formulation of the Guiding Mind. I think for continuity and simplicity, that's a really good, encouraging sign. And I think it's encouraging that they are fully behind the growth target as well. For rail freight, from our understanding, Labour's policy doesn't really alter very differently from the Conservatives in terms of how they want to treat us. And what was also encouraging in terms of their paper they produced a couple of months ago was the recognition of the practicalities in terms of how you fairly provide paths for freight, a private freight industry and a publicly owned TOC industry. And I think it was really good that Labour demonstrated that understanding and awareness of the problem so early on. So I think we're in a really good place in terms of where we're at. Working with DB and GB and Rail Freight Group, we launched the Rail Freight Group Manifesto. I think hopefully some of you will have seen it last week. The main calls for that were halving or reducing track access by 20%, doubling MSRS, and investing in the network to provide the capacity that can allow us to achieve the 75% growth target. And we're communicating that pretty broadly to all stakeholders. We're currently hosting lots of MPs at our sites, and hopefully whichever party comes in, due to that cross-party support for the industry, there'll be a really positive wellstream of activity in the next few years.
Yeah, as I said at the start, it's really heartening that we've got cross-industry support that we've been called out in the top 3 manifestos. And Matthew, I'm very impressed you read the Reform manifesto, but okay. So good. Support from the top 3, which is really heartening for us. I think more the question is, what are we going to do in the first few weeks? And how are we going to address it and how are we going to tackle it?
Okay.
So we've got a really big job on our hands, I think, in terms of influencing, lobbying a new government.
You don't see much difference at the moment
Will I see much difference?
between the manifestos.
Not really. Not really. They commit to freight growth.
I mean, it looks
Brilliant.
that way. but
Private
I won't-
sector investment and supporting freight growth.
Yeah.
They say the right things. So it's a level playing field. That's great for us. We've got a really big job to do as an industry to get into the new cabinet and to start lobbying, influencing those big policy decisions. When we're looking at the fiscal event in the autumn, what does that mean for us? Can we enable track access? Can we
More of a
enable
chance to
MSRs?
change things than anything
Exactly.
else with a fresh...
Exactly, and given what's going on in the wider passenger world, we really will have a tough job in the first few weeks and months to lobby and change policy.
Right, okay. You mentioned your incubator thing, which you were suggesting to them. Briefly, anything else you think?
Well, as colleagues have said, we're in a good place from a policy perspective. And although it's not freight specifically, it's really important that whoever comes in implements rail reform, because without that, we're in such a mess in terms of organisation. So it's really important that happens. From a freight perspective, I think the key things are that we now need to see action from the ministerial team that comes in to back up the manifesto commitments. That, quite a bit of that is education, I would say, rather than lobbying. You get new ministers coming into the job. If you're really lucky, you get somebody like Hugh Merriman, who's good and understands it, and Chris Heaton-Harris was another good one. Chances are we won't. Chances are we'll get someone who has not much idea of industry or transport at all, so a lot of education to do. But what we must do, and it's almost like one of those famous 100-day things, is to get them to understand what they can do and the low cost of making things happen with freight compared to passenger. Because passenger schemes are often hundreds of millions or billions of pounds. As I suggested earlier, freight schemes can be tens of millions or even single-figure millions. Electrification of the London Gateway branch, £8 million. That is lost in the roundings of something like Transpennine route upgrade. So we need to get the message across to ministers really clearly, really quickly. There is something that you can do to make things happen without Rachel Reeves or whoever it might be getting too excited about the budget required for it. We can achieve an awful lot with not very much in welfare. That's the key message we need to get across to them, whether it is in investment in infrastructure, whether it's in facilities grants, whether it's in revenue incentives like the incubator grant I mentioned.
Okay, some slightly more positive views of Merriman there compared to our last speaker, Mick Whelan, who's not so keen. Okay, I'm going to answer questions from the audience. Yes, gentleman in the back.
When you talk about track access, are you talking about the speed at which freight goes through the network? Because there's a black and white film about 70 odd years ago saying
One of you guys want to take that first?
Do I start? So, two sides to that. So track access, we're referring to it in terms of cost and charges to us, and that absolutely has to come down. You know, it's a huge lever for us. Yeah, we do need that to come down. But you're absolutely right in terms of sectional running times and how we operate on the network. We are slow. We're not prioritised on the network. We'll be put into loops for 3-4 hours at a time, waiting for multiple passenger units to go past, often with a lot of fresh air on them. Very, very expensive fresh air at that. You know, which is why, from our perspective, we'd like to look at timetabling. We'd like to look at better use, better access, better prioritisation of freight on the network. And looking forward to the next years ahead, quite excited about ETCS projects and what that means for freight in terms of capacity, in terms of reducing sectional running times to make the network more streamlined for freight.
I've been trying to get a phrase. I was familiar with just-in-time logistics. I've always been trying to push right on time logistics, right in getting there at the appropriate time. Both in terms of the duration it takes to get there, but also for the customer in terms of what they need to then do in terms of processing the goods. Right, also in terms of like environmental and social concerns as well. But I totally agree. I think as someone who's relatively new into the industry, I think there's still a lot of scope and opportunity there to improve how we intelligently design the network and move goods around. Not necessarily just faster trains. I was shocked about the statistics similar that you refer to, and the similar statistic about how trains in Scotland are slower than they were like 70 years ago or something absurd. So I'm not sure it's necessarily faster. And I often refer to the Swiss rail network as a good example for that. The Swiss rail network is incredibly efficient, really well timed. But it's not the fastest one in the world. And again, another way of looking at it, when a box has come all the way from Shanghai and taken 45 days to get here, if it's another 3 or 4 hours delayed in that process, it's quite important. But over the scheme of that delivery, we need to keep it in context to some extent.
Yeah, just to add to that, it does depend on the market you're serving. So bulk materials and deep sea containers, most of it probably isn't critical to an hour. But domestic logistics is. That's where just-in-time really matters. So these long-distance domestic paths we've been talking about, they are time critical. There is a small niche of the market where going faster than 75 miles an hour could be worth doing, maybe up to 90 miles an hour. We can do it. We've already got multi-freight wagons which will do 90. But that isn't the solution. So anybody that says to you, we must make freight go faster, only in a very, very small niche. If we could get anywhere near 75 miles an hour, we'd be shouting from the rooftops. The secret to it really is timetable construction most of the place. And of course, freight is more challenging for timetablers because we generally go across the main passenger routes. So Felixstowe to Trafford Park goes across, is it 3 routes, I think? And timetablers generally think in terms of the main intercity type routes. So it's more challenging, but I think Freightliner are finding, Matthew, that you're taking 1 or 2 trains which would really benefit from a replan, and the results of that are actually quite encouraging. That sitting down with train plans saying, look, we need to get some improvement in these transit times. It's working. And the reason for that is that the timetable just evolves ever so slowly and it ossifies really. So every so often we need just to take a clean sheet of paper with capacity on a particular route and say, what do we need to, how can we make this better? Then, of course, you inevitably come to a point where there is no more capacity. And we will find that very soon around College and Stafford on the West Coast Main Line if we're not going to get phase 2 of HS2. Then it comes down to priorities. And at that point, I think we would probably argue that it should come down to the benefit-cost ratio. Whose train develops the biggest benefit for UK PLC? We happen to, most of ours, generate a very big benefit, in fact. So do well-loaded intercity trains and well-loaded commuter trains. Small local trains with half a dozen people on a wet Wednesday in November, that really should not be taken priority, but it does. The old class 1, class 2, class 4, class 6 hierarchy is exactly what still applies, and that's fundamentally wrong. So we do need GBR, and we've not talked about GBR really yet. Yeah. It's one of the key things that Great British Railways, even in transition team mode, can do, is to take a much more balanced strategic view of the asset we've got in terms of the network and determine how we most effectively use that. Once we've done that, then we can go to ministers and say, we need some money, please, for doubling the Felixstowe branch, doubling between Soham and Ely, and dyno-rodding 1 or 2 other bottlenecks on the network. But yet again, a bit like I was saying earlier about installation, private selling costs, there's a lot more we can do in-house first before we go rattling the begging bowl.
Another question, please. Oh, spot for choice. Take the gentleman here first. I promise you, you'll all get to ask.
Lee Armstrong from Associated British Ports. Agree with everything you've said. The big long list of rail reform, control of costs, incentives, the list goes on. But ultimately, in summary, what the new government needs to do is create an environment where investment is encouraged in the long term. Because at the moment, if you invest in a lorry and a trailer, you can turn left or right out the gate and you can move pretty much any commodity in it later on. To invest in rail assets, terminals, wagons, locos, big investment. You need certainty that if you're investing in an electric loco, you've got that electricity rate for the long term and not stuck with a massive investment and a white elephant 6-7 years down the road. These investments are for 20 years. The question I've got is with rail freight growth at the moment is all containerised freight, whether it's deep sea, short sea or domestic. Do you see, if all the conditions are in the right place for people to invest, that you'll see new markets to rail, such as timber, fertiliser, grain, that we used to move many years ago?
Okay, quite briefly, please, because I'd like to get the other questions in if we can. So who'd like to go first on this?
I'll happily take that because we've done a fair bit of work in terms of new markets. The answer is yes, but a very much a targeted approach. So there's quite a bit of work going on in terms of timber and particularly timber products. So some round timber from forests into board plants, but very much more so board plants to markets in the south of England. That's a significant market. Yes to agricultural products as well, but there's a bit of a danger of trying to do everything for everyone at the same time. We've got to focus and just go at the things which have got the best chance of delivering for us. To be honest, if I was an investor, I think I'd be saying something like, invest my money in increasing capacity for aggregates and increasing it for intermodal. And how then we can accrete other things around that would be my investment policy, I think.
Okay, so completely agree. Yes, I do think there is growth for the market. And I think if you look at how the railway was originally created, it was to move coal from A to B. As Julian said at the start, we have no coal. And last coal train next week, so there's no coal. So if you look at what we're really good at, it's good at moving fuels and moving bulk commodities around. So for me, I'd be looking at alternative fuel sources and products that are going to support decarbonisation and sustainability. And that's where we should be looking and pivoting to growth.
Just very quickly, very much agree as well. I think what we need to do is really get out of our rail bubble and move into the sort of industrial strategy bubble, making sure that when we're considering industrial strategy over the next few years, whether it be in terms of steel or carbon capture or whatever it might be, rail is at the forefront of that consideration, so that when they're thinking about how that good will be moved onward, whereas distributed throughout the UK, rail is considered as one of the foremost options there.
There's the unknown unknowns as well. So things like carbon capture and hydrogen, which might happen and might offer opportunities for rail, could offer very big opportunities for rail, but we don't yet know how far they will develop and what the slice for rail will be in it.
Okay. Those two questions, they still stand. Yes, this gentleman at the front here.
Thanks. Nick Smith from Epion. Agree entirely with the issues you raise around the need for investment, around capacity, around timetabling. But I'm wondering if freight is a bit like prisons. There's not a lot of votes to be won by reforming prisons in the way they need to be reformed. And living near East West Rail, where public attitudes towards freight on that, because it would be overnight, means nobody's building the infrastructure in the way that it would work for freight. I'm wondering if there is actually a public campaign or education that's needed, as well as politicians.
Yep, I take that.
Of course.
Completely agree. And it's something that I am hugely passionate about. So we talked earlier a little bit about lobbying, about influencing and educating for me, educating members of the public about who we are, what we do and why we're important. Can I just ask a quick question to the audience? How many of you use rail freight? How many? 1, 2, 3, 4, any more? 5, 6. In a room almost full of people, 6 of you should all put your hand up.
That's unusual, though. 5 or 6 is unusual, right?
Thanks, Julian. You are all customers of rail freight. Apples on your table, wine in your cupboards, in your fridges. It's all delivered by rail freight. Cars, houses. You're all customers of rail freight, and that's why we need to start and change public perception.
Absolutely. Yeah, and more, as well as that, we probably have to make it more direct, more blunt. And that, for me, is about saying, When you got last stuck on the motorway, how many lorries were jamming you up? And how many lorries can we take off that motorway by putting them on trains? About 50 or 60 for every train that we operate. It's a huge multiplier effect. So we need to be a little bit careful because, of course, nearly all those trains, as we said earlier, the containers will have to go on trucks for the final delivery, which generally speaking will take them closer into people's where they live and such like. So it's a tricky one, but there's if you like pulling at people's heartstrings and what motivates people, we need to do more about that without alienating the roadside because we need roads. So it's a carefully constructed message, but I think we do need to up the ante and make it a bit blunter.
There's an environmental message to be made.
Yeah.
A strong one, that's
Absolutely.
Have you got a view?
Nothing really to add.
Okay, right.
It was brilliant.
Yes, gentleman in the middle who's
No, in my luck.
second attempt. So I think there's a mic coming. Is there?
Sorry, who's
Yeah.
in favour of diesel? Most of us would regard that as a retrograde step and one which doesn't go down well in the world in general, does it? How much have electricity prices got to drop or diesel prices got to increase before you can review that move?
So I'll answer this very much from a DB perspective. I know Freightline have a different stance on things. So we've taken the decision to remove the Class 90s from our fleet. Obviously, we still have 92s. None of you understand about traction. They're our international locomotives, and we still use them. They are electric. We took the decision to rationalise and homogenise our fleet, but just because we've taken our electrics out doesn't mean that we're not working on sustainability. We're actually now investing in HVO as a biofuel, as a drop-in agent, to put that into our diesel locomotives. So it's not really a question of sustainability for us, it's more about economic sustainability rather than environmental sustainability. But the unit rate still needs to come down.
Okay, anyone else want to comment?
We're not going to switch our 90s back on, no.
But we need to see UK electricity supply being decoupled from international oil prices and gas prices, which is what drives it so crazily high at the minute. Because we need to remember, everybody in this room, I'm sure, would agree, electric rail is a mature, proven technology. Unlike almost any other mode's decarbonisation strategy, with all the issues about is it electric, is it hydrogen, charging, fueling, all the rest of it, we've got to be better at pushing that and saying to people, we are the low-risk option. Decarbonisation by modal switch is the low-risk option. Again, to do that, though, we need to get the cost of electrification down. Right? So Great Western at £2.5 million a single track kilometre, Midland Main Line, I'm told, is even worse. That's a scandal. It's an absolute scandal. Right? So we did some work with the electrification industry. Simon Skinner was speaking this afternoon. We've demonstrated that for freight up to 75 miles an hour, we can electrify at £800,000 per single track kilometre. That's a third of the Great Western. Now, at the minute, Treasury are not unreasonably saying, you're just too expensive. We're not going to put more money into electrification. You're too expensive. You're inefficient. Do you know what? They're right. They're absolutely right. And we need to demonstrate that we can do electrification quickly, easily, cheaply, non-disruptively. Then we'll start making some progress on the decarbonisation agenda.
Matthew, you're going to add something?
And not too much to add in terms of the pricing there. I think in terms of overcoming that short-term differential in the cost, I think it's very much just in terms of building. There are people that are willing to do it. It's not true that no one is willing to pay it. And it's building those alliances and building those long-term relationships with customers who do believe in that that value in paying for that premium. So I think in the short term, really identifying those customers and those operators that want to support electric traction in the short term is really key step.
Last question from someone. Yes, order.
Hiya, thanks. I'm Rob Thompson, work for Siemens. I just wanted to ask you, you've talked quite a bit about structural changes and you kind of hinted at ETCS kind of helping, but do you see any other role, or what role do you see for any other technology innovations to help the freight services and how you can to serve customers?
All right. I'll tell if you like.
Look, I think that our sector is absolutely ripe for technological development? Yes, I do. our assets. So our Class 66s are at half life. They've probably got about another 30 years left in them. We have some wagons on the network that are 40 years old. So I think there's a huge opportunity within our sector to do things better, cleaner, greener, more efficiently through the use of technology. Absolutely. I mean, there are things that are happening today. So the great things that are happening with iWagon, super, ETCS, really, really excited about that project. So not only will it bring a technological advantage to the sector, it will also open it up to hopefully a new generation of colleagues wanting to come into rail. You know, I'd like to see kids, you know, school leavers, grads thinking about rail as a career choice, and it will do that. But yeah, there's huge opportunity to revolutionise our sector through tech.
Matthew.
Again, it's for someone who's relatively new in the industry, it's been one of the surprising aspects of it. At moments I've thought, crikey, it's really like back in the dark ages and stuff, and reading like stories of like British Rail and things, I think it hasn't really changed that much. And then you go to other ends of the spectrum and you look at the really amazing tech that's being deployed in really intelligent ways. And often I think we're sort of working at sort of two bandwidths in terms of our sort of tech development in the sector, which I find really fascinating, and I don't really know how that's come about or how we actually resolve that. Going back to my thing yesterday, I think there's a lot of similarities with other modes in terms of uncertainty about where technology is going and how you invest in that and how you develop it in the future. For those investors, it's all about certainty. In shipping context, where I sort of originate from, there's a lot of investors coming out of the market because they're just unclear about what options there are in the future. They're just scared of the variety that there might be. And I think trying to identify, not winners, because we're all at risk of identifying those and failing accordingly. But I think certainly trying to narrow down where we think the future options might be will be of assistance to investors. It will hopefully be able to concentrate some of our assets and resource in terms of developing and accelerating the development of those ideas and those technologies. So I think in the next few years, certainly putting a lot of effort in terms of trying to identify the key ones and the key sort of principles, the building blocks for which we want to go forward in those technology designs, I think is quite key. Because at the moment, it's diverse and it's good that we have that diversity, but it can maybe put a lot of people off.
Yeah, I would say yes, but in the sense that clearly some of the things that are already coming through, especially things like iWagon, are really, really helpful. But what customers want more than anything else is boring reliability. The last thing that they want us to do is playing around with fancy new tech which will muck up their tightly honed supply chains. So whatever we do, it must work. Ideally, it's fairly low key, it's fairly internal to the rail delivery model and part of the industry. And that's not to say that at the front end of rail freight marketing and business development, there aren't some tech tools that will help us do so. But we mustn't run away thinking the solution and the future for rail freight is in tech, because I don't believe it is. I think it's a few things. And I would take, you're probably all too young actually, looking at you, perhaps not Andy in the front row there. TOPS was a huge technological innovation in about 1973. We were the first railway in the world to have a properly asset control system, computer-based, 50 years ago. Sadly, through the privatization process, we lost a lot of that evolutionary technological improvement. But that's what we need to get back to. It's evolutionary rather than revolutionary, is my view on how we need to do tech.
Well, I'd like to see a tech revolution in our sector. We still have fax machines, Julian. There are still fax machines in some of our sites. I'd like to see a wholesale tech revolution in terms of everything from the locos that we have, wagons, how we move our people, how we manage them, deployment of assets. I think we are ripe for tech revolution.
Well, I'm glad we can disagree on something.
And you can find a lot of it here, I guess.
Yeah.
So there we go. Thanks very much. Please join me in thanking our panel on freight. Thank you very much for their time.
Thank you.
Thank you.